All right, everybody. We laughed, we cried, but I think we made it. I think we're live. My name is Mark Lerner. I am the Director of Growth Marketing at DealHub. And I'm joined here by my buddy Cameron Collins, who I'll let introduce himself.
Yeah, my name is Cameron Collins. I'm a revenue operations strategist with RevPartners. I'm a community manager with SprocketPod. We're the largest admin group for HubSpot admin and RevOps professionals.
And we are doing our first Friday chat on the SprocketPod live stream. And we're just no scripts here, just doing it live. But Cameron and I got to meet in person for the first time on the sidelines of the Inbound conference. As you can see, this is a picture from our booth at that conference. And it's hard for me to recognize Cameron without his bright orange attire. But we actually just put out a podcast this week, parts of the conversation we had back then, as well as some more recent conversations. And we thought it'd be really interesting to start doing it on a regular basis. Here we are. We're gonna hopefully be doing this every Friday, streaming it live, and hopefully get some more folks involved as we go along. But yeah, I wanted to kick things off with you, Cameron. How was your week?
My week was amazing. It's been really busy just getting the SprocketPod community ignited. We've been working on a lot of initiatives just like this to really focus on educating more and more people about revenue operations. And so creating a lot of content for that, as well as on the sidelines to that, or more specifically, that is sidelined to being full-time as a revenue operations strategist. In addition to creating content, most of my time is spent also working with partners, helping to build and scale their HubSpot instances out.
Cool. Yeah. It's been an interesting week here as well on some of the stuff I've been doing. We put out our podcast conversation from this week, I think just yesterday. And I think there was some really interesting stuff in there that might be cool to double click on. When I went back and looked at the recording from the conversation, the aspect of the conversation that we had at Inbound, we were talking about this definition of RevOps, right? And how it's like everybody defines it differently. And I think I had said something like, we as marketers tend to just love to name things and then make it as complex as possible. And every little thing has its own name. But yeah, I think it's interesting to maybe double click on what is revenue operations? What is RevOps? What does it mean? Is it just a fancy word for something that's always been there? Or is it truly a change in the way companies are organized and their processes are done? So I think from your perspective, let's kick it off. What is revenue operations?
Yeah, so revenue operations, we define it as the science of sustainable revenue growth. Mm-hmm. And it's not new. Every business does revenue operations. Whether or not they're tracking metrics related to revenue operations is a very different story. But every business is doing revenue operations to one degree or another. Do they have a dedicated professional to it? Maybe not, but that is a different conversation for another time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I had told you about my experience with revenue operations and a few years ago, before I'd taken on a role that was focused on this space. I was joining a company, and obviously revenue operations, that the main user of the product was going to be revenue operations. It was deeply embedded in revenue operations as a space. And actually, I had to Google what is revenue operations, and there was a million answers, and none of them quite made sense. And it took a while to realize that this is actually fundamentally an issue, because you can still do it today, and everybody, there's no kind of streamlined answer to it. But over the years, I've spoken to many people, many RevOps folks, leaders. I've had a much better idea of kind of the way go-to-market teams are organizing themselves now. And I think it's, from my perspective, it's really, there's a fundamental issue where people are jumping on a bandwagon saying we need to hire a RevOps person. And what they're really hiring for is an admin for their CRM or something, like a completely tactical position that has no influence on strategic decision-making or processes or anything like that. Whereas I think that's the exact opposite approach. RevOps, I think, is part of a larger change that companies have been making, in which organizations within the company that influence revenue, sales, marketing, customer success, and the like, are actually removing the silos that traditionally separated them and creating a more unified organization with the company. And that's the growth of the job title of like chief revenue officer that kind of sits on top of that entire thing, I think is a manifestation of that as well, because companies realize that revenue is not only about net new revenue. It is not only about closing a deal. There's touch points along the way. There's revenue from growing existing customers. There are things that happen that influence revenue beyond that. And it's really important that those organizations stay together. And then from the process perspective, I think so many processes were broken over time, and companies were just priced that into their calculations. And the smarter companies realized that you could build processes that streamlined and optimized the way companies go to market. And a lot of that focused on data and data quality and all the various tools that everybody's using. There's been like this proliferation of tools. For each team has its own tool, and so many of them. And if those exist in silos, then things get really broken. And I think that all of that has led to this idea of someone in revenue operations that both manages the connections between those tools, but also the processes that align those teams. And so I think that's where I've landed. But yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said about the fact that in just a short amount of time, it went from a relatively unknown title to being, I think, the most sought after job title on LinkedIn last year. I think that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And so something that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on are when it comes to aligning stakeholders. So a lot of companies may say we have somebody that helps us to optimize sales or marketing or CS. And oftentimes this can be independent. But a lot of what we do as a revenue operations professional is aligning the goals and the values of stakeholders. And so for me, sometimes that means helping to organize the competing interests of these various departments. VP of marketing has their goals, VP of sales has their goals. What's your opinion as far as some of the ways that as professionals, we can really make sure that we're keeping our seat at the table, but making sure that those priorities are being met as well?
Yeah, I think there's a saying, something like, show me an incentive, I'll show you an outcome, or show me an outcome, I'll show you an incentive. I think that this idea that each of these different departments have their own goals, while on the surface it might make sense, I think it is often the source of so much friction and issues, because you're incentivizing, let's say, customer success to onboard a new customer, and their bonuses are based on how many new customers that go live. But if they're not preparing those customers to be successful and they're just pushing them through to pad their numbers, then you're going to see a huge amount of churn, right? So the sales could be closing deals, customer success could be pushing people along, and then those people churn immediately. And someone at the top is looking at that and not understanding where things are broken. Where things are broken is you're not incentivizing the right thing. The right thing is recurring revenue. And I've always felt that regardless of the department, there should be a North Star that is a revenue-focused incentive. Obviously, there are touch points along the way, but if everybody's only focused on like their own thing, you're going to get all sorts of problems. If marketing is incentivized by marketing qualified lead is arbitrary. Sales isn't closing deals, they're blaming it on marketing, and marketing say, hey, we got 700,000 marketing qualified leads this month, don't blame us. It doesn't work. I think it's part of the bigger picture of breaking down silos, is that when everyone's in their own world and incentivized on their own metrics that aren't related to the bigger picture, you're going to get a lot of problems. And so for me, and I've always felt this way, regardless of the size of the company, and I realize the bigger the company, the more complex things get, it should be focused on revenue, whether that's expansion revenue on a customer success or account executive side, or net new revenue, or whatever it is, influence revenue from marketing, all of that. It needs to have a revenue, especially today in a time where the market's become much more tough. There's this macroeconomic headwinds. There's more churn. It's harder to get a new customer. It's more expensive to get a new customer. The focus on that, the metric of NRR as the recurring revenue and expansion revenue, having it above 100%, is super important and one that I think has been left to the side for too long.
Yeah, and I think that having those goals aligned is really important, especially when we think about breaking down what is the most important thing to a business. And every business has its own KPIs that it's going to be interested in. But what are some of the ways that a business can work backwards or forwards to get an understanding of what are their core KPIs? How do we break that down into marketing, sales, CS goals?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question. And I think there are a lot of variables at play there and probably very different for different companies. One of the great things about where we are today, and I guess I'll be the first one to bring up this topic, but previously to be able to identify leading indicators and signals in the noise of data required a data science team and all sorts of expensive tooling. The cost of leveraging things like machine learning and AI, people who are not data scientists are able to use tools like this. And I think that if you have a big enough data set, historical data set, being able to sick a machine learning model onto your data to find those things is actually easier today than it ever was. And I don't think people are quite embracing that as much as folks like us use ChatGPT, which has really lowered the bar in terms of interacting with AI. But there are tools out there and technology out there that can do the same thing for data with a very low bar to entry. And so I think that you're going to see more and more tools like that in which you can look at historical data, analyze it, and identify KPIs and what's important, as well as leading indicators that you should be focusing on, whether they're churn risk or growth opportunity scoring. All of that, I think, is going to become table stakes going forward.
And I think that's really interesting. I know that one of the things that was a major theme in the lead up to inbound and in the time thereafter has been the Hubvolution. And the Hubvolution has been focused around the movement of companies toward the HubSpot CRM. And so I think one question that a lot of people have asked is HubSpot right for me? Is this the CRM of choice? Does it make sense? Should I be maybe using a different option? What's your opinion as far as answering that question?
Yeah, and this may sound naive. I've yet to see a company or use case where like you going to using HubSpot was not possible. I've always heard people say, "Oh, we're too big, we're too much this, we could never leave Salesforce." I've never heard a solid answer as to why. It's almost like this kind of faith without any proof. It's just there's this idea that you must use Salesforce. And I think part of it is that there's this cottage industry that's the Salesforce industrial complex that's built up around it. And so if your entire career has been focused on that, you don't want to give it up. But I have yet to see a use case. And we're seeing very large companies starting to move to HubSpot. I know that DealHub was partnered on a deal with a very large company somewhat recently that moved to HubSpot. And part of what HubSpot's done that's very smart is they've built an ecosystem of technology and implementation partners that is very flexible, that wherever there needs to be some part of the product that needs additional power, they've made it very easy for people to plug into that. I know that from a technology partner perspective, in the Salesforce ecosystem, I forgot the name of their kind of marketplace, but the incentives there are very difficult. I think they take quite a bit of a cut off of every purchase inside that marketplace. It doesn't really incentivize new and interesting technologies, whereas HubSpot doesn't have that barrier to entry at all. They are very much want you to benefit from the ecosystem that they've created. And I know that for DealHub, HubSpot's been a fantastic partner and opportunity, because what DealHub offers is something that larger companies that have more complex sales processes, more complex pricing that, let's say, the kind of built-in HubSpot quotes doesn't support. We can natively integrate with DealHub, with HubSpot, and be able to provide that kind of native experience within the HubSpot CRM for a more mid-market or enterprise customer to be able to leverage HubSpot in a way that I think a lot of people assumed wasn't possible. And then with Ops Hub and all of the APIs and everything like that, I just I haven't seen a use case where it wasn't possible. There's always that it's really hard to rip and replace, and I get it. And I would never judge somebody. You have to think about the costs and benefits there. But I do know that in terms of comparing to Salesforce with their additional clouds, their revenue cloud, their marketing cloud, all those things, as well as the CRM itself, it's not just the additional costs, and the cost has been increasing. There's also implementation costs. I know that for Salesforce CPQ, we're talking about sometimes six figures, higher, mid to high six figures implementation costs. And the time it takes to implement something like Salesforce CPQ can be many months. Something like 2/3 of those implementations fail. The argument that I've heard, which is that, oh, we're too big, we're too complex, it would never work. I don't know, it doesn't quite carry water for me, but I'm interested to hear your perspective.
I think the most simple analogy is to think of it where HubSpot would be akin to Apple and Salesforce is akin to Android. And there's a lot of other CRMs, just as there's a lot of other phone companies out there. But if you think about it in terms of that analogy, HubSpot is the most easy to use platform. It's easy to build with, it's easy to learn, it's easy to adopt and use as both an admin and as an end user. And so I think from that perspective, are we too big? Are we too complex? Being bigger and more complex might mean that it takes longer to get you set up relative to a quote unquote more simple company, but it doesn't mean that there are things that cannot be done within HubSpot. And I think that's an important distinction because at the end of the day, you're weighing the cost and the benefit and doing the trade-offs as far as what do we want to do. I don't think that HubSpot is not right for anybody. It's just weighing the trade-off of how long does it take us to make this transition, and is that something we want to pull the trigger on now?
Yeah.
And so ultimately, I definitely think that one of the great things you mentioned is that HubSpot is built around community, and you have the App Store, which is built for all of the solutions partners to get involved. You have the solutions directory for partners like RevOps or RevPartners and other companies that want to get involved and help companies and users to grow and scale. And HubSpot is really built for the people, which is something that I've always admired because I started my journey trying to learn how to do the Trailhead courses and trying to learn Salesforce. And then I started using HubSpot as a user, and then I started using HubSpot as an admin. And having done both, it's been a much easier journey to get involved with both the community, but also from the admin standpoint with HubSpot. So I want to kick it over because I know we have a few more moments to wrap. Mark, do you have any final thoughts or touch points on HubSpot and revenue operations?
Yeah, I think that one of the big takeaways I had from inbound in general, from talking to you and a whole other bunch of folks, and then the people that came to our booth, is that part of this movement that we're seeing of companies that kind of traditionally would have just discounted the possibility of any other CRM besides the more traditional ones, starting to move to HubSpot, is that it brings in more folks in a RevOps role that have expectations and needs and use cases that are aligned with that role. And I see HubSpot being very smart in knowing that's happening and starting to support it. And I think that's in the very HubSpot way of doing things. They've slowly iterated over time, introducing new features. But what's really interesting is that over the last few months since inbound, the amount of new features that have been released it happens so much, it's hard to follow every day. It's one little thing that you don't automatically assume is a huge difference, but there's something that someone's been praying for years to change. It's like a field can do this now, then it didn't do it before. Is like the one thing that someone has been just praying for, and they're making their day. And I'm seeing that more and more. And it seems like HubSpot got the message. So I see them kind of building an ecosystem that is possibly the most friendly to RevOps of any of the kind of CRM ecosystems that there are.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. I remember I had a conversation with a few of the team members on the product team at HubSpot, and they mentioned that when it came to what they'd been doing last year over 2022, it wasn't that they weren't making updates, but it was a lot of back-end updates that would ultimately support the pace of growth with what we're seeing now. And so I would definitely agree with you that things are evolving very quickly. We're getting a lot of new features very rapidly. And it's really amazing to see because you're right. There are a lot of things that have been requested over the years, which now it's all coming to fruition and it's happening at a very rapid pace. And I think that it just really speaks to the fact that HubSpot listens to the people, they listen to their community requests and are cries that have been heard. And so that is something that from me and from Mark, we appreciate you, HubSpot, for listening to the community in that regard.
Yeah.
So, Mark, I appreciate the time that we've had on this SprocketPod chat. I know we're going to be doing more of these, but how are people going to best be able to follow you if they're not already checking you out on LinkedIn here?
Yes, on LinkedIn, Mark Lerner, you can find me. I think there's a few other Mark Lerners, but I'm not the owner of the Washington Nationals, so that should help narrow it down. I'm also on Twitter/X as Mark the Marketer, MARKDA Marketer. And you can check out DealHub.io. I also do a daily newsletter called Rev Daily that curates that day's most interesting RevOps related resources and kind of identifies trends that are going to be impacting RevOps folks in the future. So you can definitely check that out. We'll drop a link to that in the show notes or in the comments for the recording. And yeah, looking forward to seeing everybody again as we continue to do this.
Amazing. And for everyone that's listening and checking this out, I would encourage you to not only follow Mark, check out the Sprocketeer community. Again, it is the largest community for HubSpot admin. It's a place for everyone to go and not only show your awesomeness, but both help others with complex problems as well as receive help if you have questions or need assistance with anything in your HubSpot instance. Thank you for checking out the SprocketPod chat and have a wonderful day.